Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're setting up a fascinating, almost clinical character study of a fallen king. We're going to look at the god Indra from ancient Indian texts, but, not in the way you might be used to. Instead, we're basically putting him on the psychologist's couch to figure out what happens when absolute, unquestioned power collides with deep-seated vulnerability. Okay, let's dive into this. How did the fearless king of the gods become his own worst enemy? Across centuries of Indian literature, Indra transforms from this supreme macho warrior into an insecure, paranoid, and profoundly flawed figure. It's a wildly dramatic evolution of a character who starts out literally ruling the heavens, only to be humiliated, cursed, and stripped of his dignity time and time again. So, to understand this tragic flaw, we really need to trace his journey right from the very beginning.
Section 1. The Invincible Vedic King.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer depth of Indra's eventual downfall, we first have to establish his original baseline. Back in the historical Vedic texts, Indra was the absolute top dog, the most frequently mentioned deity. He was this invincible warrior, the idealized Vedic hero who literally sliced open mountains and slew the giant drought dragon Vritra with his thunderbolt. I mean, he was the ultimate authority. But centuries later, a Puranic critic emerges. This later version of Indra is deeply insecure, totally ruled by his own ego, and constantly fearful of human ascetics stealing his throne. It's a stunning night-and-day contrast. Just listen to this early praise from the Rig Veda, hymn 1.32. It says, "He smashed the serpent. For him, Tvastar had fashioned the resounding mace." Originally, Indra was the one absolute sovereign who protected his people with just brute strength and unparalleled martial prowess. He was the idealized warrior king, right? Leading predatory raids, bringing the rain, conquering through sheer unrestrained force. He didn't need trickery. He didn't need deception. He just crushed his obstacles head on.
Section 2. Lust, Deception, and Humiliation.
Let's move to Sama and see how this builds, because as ancient Indian society evolved, brute force was simply no longer enough to maintain absolute authority. And so Indra began to rely on deception. Let's map out the exact sequence of his downfall in one of his most infamous moral lapses, the Ahalya myth. First, he relies on a cowardly disguise, literally waiting for the powerful aesthetic sage Gautama to leave so he can take on his exact form. Next, he approaches Gautama's wife, Ahalya, and seduces her. But the act doesn't last long before the real Gautama returns and discovers the whole charade. And then comes the devastating curse. This is the moment where the macho warrior king is utterly, totally broken. According to the Padma Purana, when Gautama catches him, out of fear, Shakra stood before that sage as a suppliant, hands joined. Now, Shakra is just another name for Indra. And it gets worse. Earlier in this text, Indra actually tries to flee by transforming into a slinking cat. Just imagine that for a second. The mighty dragon slayer, the king of the gods, literally turning into a sneaky little cat to hide from a human sage, and then standing before him absolutely terrified, begging with joined hands. It is a pathetic, deeply humiliating image. And for his crime of unrestrained lust, the sage Gautama delivers a shocking and incredibly bizarre punishment. The number is 1,000. Specifically, Indra is cursed to lose his male anatomy, and his body is permanently marked with 1,000 vulvas. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that this shocking punishment isn't just some eccentric myth. It's actually a profound analytical metaphor. It is a literal physical manifestation of his crime, resulting in direct emasculation, a total loss of his royal rank, and immense public dishonor among both gods and men. The curse fits the crime perfectly, right? Indra, the divine warrior, couldn't control his sexual desire for a woman, and so his punishment strips him of his masculinity and brands him with the very female anatomy he lusted after. He is humiliated in the most public way imaginable.
Section 3. Paranoia and Crushed Egos.
So Indra's deep-seated insecurity wasn't just about his lack of control over his lust. It extended into this crippling paranoia about losing his heavenly position. Look at the specific triggers of this paranoia. Indra was surrounded by constant threats to his throne, and we're not just talking about monsters here. He was terrified of rishis, human ascetics, who were building up massive supernatural power through their tapasyas, or intense penances. He was threatened by human kings, performing grand yagyas, or sacrifices, which could elevate their spiritual status to rival his own. And, of course, he was terrified of asuras with magical powers. This is a god constantly looking over his shoulder. Because his old method, brute strength, is completely useless against these intellectual and spiritual threats, he feels forced to rely on political trickery, espionage, and deception. And his ego takes a hit not just in Hindu texts, but across entirely different religious traditions as well. If we compare Hinduism's mighty warrior, regal, commanding, seated on his magnificent white elephant, to Buddhism's humble Saka, the shift is staggering. Buddhist traditions entirely reframed him. They didn't erase him, they reduced him. In Buddhism, he resides in the Triastrimsha heaven not as an absolute supreme deity, but as a mortal being bound by karma, who frequently bows as a humble disciple to the Buddha. His status is completely redefined, from divine supremacy to a mere protector of the Dharma. And back in the Hindu Puranas, his ego is crushed yet again by newer, more evolved deities. In one super famous story, Indra unleashes massive, nuisance rains out of sheer anger and wounded pride just because local villagers stopped sacrificing to him. And how does the young god Krishna respond? She effortlessly lifts Mount Govardhana on his pinky finger to protect the villagers. Krishna essentially tells the farmers, hey, Indra's power is irrelevant. Just focus on your daily karma and farming duties. Indra's mighty thunderbolts are rendered completely useless against Krishna's calm, effortless divinity. Once again, Indra is forced to fold his hands and beg for forgiveness. Section 4. Diagnosing Divine Insecurity. And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension. We've seen the symptoms, right? The paranoia, the trickery, the lust. Now let's diagnose the root cause. This sociocultural shift in ancient India tells the whole story. On one side, we have the Kshatriya, the warrior class that Indra represents, defined by brute strength, lust, and completely unrestrained action. But over centuries, society began to value a new ideal, the Brahmin, characterized by the ascetic, the intellectual, strict restraint, and formidable supernatural power. Indra's downfall is essentially his failure to bridge the gap between these two very different worlds. An academic analysis backs this up perfectly. As noted by the Cambridge University Press, ascetic restraint associated with Brahmins is set against the unrestrained sexuality of the divine Kshatriya Indra. See, Indra was built for a simpler, much more violent world. He was the ultimate warrior. But when the rules of the game changed, when power became about mastering the mind and the senses rather than just smashing your enemies with a mace, Indra simply couldn't adapt. His failure was, at its foundation, an inability to adjust to new, complex societal values. Scholar Robert Goldman takes this even deeper into psychological territory. He states, Indra represents the Oedipal tension, a divine Kshatriya son punished by a Brahmin father. So the crucial point is that this tension perfectly captures Indra as the outdated, deeply insecure old guard. He is desperately clinging to power, basically acting out like an unrestrained youth, only to be continuously disciplined and humiliated by the wiser, much more restrained ascetic fathers of this new era. If we summarize this clinical diagnosis, Indra's character reveals a profoundly relatable, almost painfully modern psychological struggle. He suffers from massive imposter syndrome in a world that has completely outgrown his ancient skill set. He displays a stubborn inability to adapt to the complexity of the new moral order. He constantly overcompensates through his massive ego, acting out and throwing these destructive tantrums when his authority is even slightly questioned. And at the absolute bedrock of all this behavior is a paralyzing fear of obsolescence. His lust, his trickery, his violence, they're all just defense mechanisms, because he is terrified of being replaced by someone smarter, more disciplined, and more spiritually advanced. Which brings us to a final, very real question for us today. How do modern leaders reflect Indra's tragic flaw, relying on brute force and ego to mask a deep, paralyzing insecurity? While Indra's an ancient myth, this psychological profile of the outdated monarch terrified of losing his throne is something we literally see in boardrooms and governments every single day. Power without restraint and adaptation ultimately leads to one's own downfall. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this gives you a completely new lens to look at the dynamics of leadership and ego out there in the real world.